joining us today. How are you?
Yeah, of course. I'm doing well. It's a little dreary outside, but I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, the rain in Ohio is definitely not something that's lifting my mood, especially during this time, but we're dealing with it like everything else. So before we kind of get into the questions, why don't you briefly introduce yourself to everyone and kind of tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Emma Haig. I'm originally from Minnesota. I am a first year master's student in the College Student Personnel Program. My assistantship is in the Allen Student Advising Center, and I work primarily with first year exploring undecided students as well as some students that are on academic probation. So that's a little bit about me and what I do.
Cool. So now that we know a little bit about you, we're going to kind of go into the questions about kind of how you're handling this crisis as a student, as well as an academic advisor and a student affairs professional. So the first question is, in your role as an academic advisor, working with primarily with undergraduate students and students on academic probation, what challenges have you seen those students facing during this time?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting variety of reactions. And I think my internet is unstable, so let me know if anything cuts out and I can repeat it.
Okay.
Um, but I think that it's been a really interesting mix of reactions. On the one hand, there are some students that are actually reacting really positively to this change because they really like being at home. They like the ability to do their work whenever it's convenient for them, and they like that there are fewer distractions. And so, actually, for a lot of the students that were on academic probation, there are a lot of positives to this. But on the other hand, I know that a lot of the first year students and, well, really just a lot of students in general are really just dealing with a lack of motivation. And I think that comes from the fact that, I mean, there was this big disruption in their lives, and a lot of them are now kind of going through the grieving process, and they're missing out on experiences that they were really excited to have. And so, it's really hard, and I can understand and relate to that, kind of trying to balance, self-care and going through that grieving process, but then also having that strength and motivation to do the things that you have to do and to carry forth with your responsibilities. So I think that really just like a motivation and lack of engagement is really what I see from some of the students that I've worked with, and also just kind of some online conversations as well.
Right. It's so hard when you're in this situation and we've never had to deal with it before, especially as professionals. And being at home for some people, like I know for me, being at home is okay for me, but for other students, it can be difficult, but also something that's motivating. So that's really interesting that you brought that perspective of people who are actually doing well with the change of being able to go home and be in a comfortable environment and kind of finish out their schooling that way.
Yeah, and that's certainly not the case for everyone, because like I have a handful of students in particular where like this is definitely not an environment that's going to be conducive to their productivity. And so, yeah, it was very interesting to me because those were the perspectives that I heard first, and I was expecting everyone to be kind of in that boat of home is not a good place for me and not a good place for me to be doing school. But then, yeah, it was like sort of an interesting surprise to hear that some people are actually doing really well with the change.
Yeah. So on to our next question. How have you as an individual, as well as your office, um, are there any creative slash helpful ways that you're dealing with the change, dealing with the challenges that students may have outside of the classroom that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing that our office is doing now that we weren't doing before is like virtual drop-in advising, and most offices are trying to simulate that in some way. But that was actually something that we were thinking about implementing even before all of this, and I think that
Cool.
um, I think it's good to be as accessible as possible. Some students don't have, when we do have the option to come in person, a lot of them don't have the time to do that, or it might be a little bit nerve wracking to come in person. And so it's been interesting to kind of test out, this, this talking in real time, drop in advising, which I think a lot of students appreciate, versus like sending an email and having to wait and wait and wait and not know when you'll get a response. So I think that it hasn't been super widely used yet because we haven't advertised it to a wide scale, but I think students appreciate that. The other sort of interesting and creative idea that we talked about in a recent staff meeting was something that my supervisor recommended for working with our students on probation. We meet with them usually about once a week, and she suggested kind of thinking about game therapy and using ways that we could connect with students through video games, especially when the real world is like kind of scary and there's, you know, some things that make it not very nice to live in this world. Having that escapism and that place to, you know, kind of remove yourself from things that are stressing you out, like that's really one of the great advantages of video games. And so we thought about, you know, if video games are this therapeutic tool for our students, like maybe we could figure out ways to use that with them. One of my colleagues is having some difficulty consistently meeting with a student now that we're in this virtual setting, and thinks that it might have something to do with you know, like anxiety or not being able to kind of have that routine. And so having a chance to like connect with them through Animal Crossing or something like that might be a good way to kind of mix like downtime and you know, time to not think about school, but then also time to kind of like reflect on goals and reflect on things that that are helpful for that, you know, self-improvement and development. So I thought that was kind of a cool idea, something that I probably won't use with my students just because I don't think they're really into video games, but that was something cool to consider, I think.
It's so interesting that an experience that can be so negative when you think about it can actually create these creative tools of connecting with students. And because I had never heard or even thought about something like video games to connect with students, especially those students who have really a hard time meeting in person and making those connections, like using this as a tool, even moving forward after this is over, could really be helpful for them and keep them engaged in the university as well as with an advisor and in their classes as well. So that's so cool.
Definitely.
Moving on to our next question. So kind of switching gears to you as a grad student, I know as a grad student myself, we're in this weird position where we're half student affairs professionals, but we're half students. And so kind of navigating that situation and being someone who is, like you said in the beginning, mourning kind of these experiences that you're supposed to be having, especially in grad school. You have 2 years of grad school, which isn't much time. And so you're kind of juggling mourning and being upset about different things that are happening. And also having to be that support for students, especially as an academic advisor, having to sit there and support students through all of this. And so I kind of just wanted to ask how you as a grad student are handling this crisis and if there have been any disruptions to your plans, and kind of speak to that.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, you're right. It's been really interesting sort of being on both sides. And especially as a student of higher education, this is a really like cool and fascinating time to watch the decisions that are being made. Not that they're really fun decisions that have to be made, but it's at least, I think, a really cool learning opportunity to sort of watch how leadership manages a big crisis situation like this. So you know, if we try to look at the bright side of things, that's sort of what I look at as that's a really good learning opportunity for me. But you know, like every day is different, and some days I really struggle to do the bare minimum of my coursework and my responsibilities, and that's okay. I've learned that I have to cut myself a little bit of slack, and just be okay with not reaching my same level of productivity that I might otherwise under normal circumstances. And so that's been a process of coming to terms with that. But I'm kind of figuring out like what works and what doesn't, and how can I work most productively for myself in these times. I also feel really fortunate because I haven't had extreme disruption to some of my, life and plans moving forward. A lot of students in my cohort are planning on doing internships this summer. And while some of them have had, a shift in plans and they have to look for a different opportunity, I know a lot of people are also going to be doing their internships remotely, which I think is really fortunate for those of us that have that opportunity. So I've been talking with the university where I'm doing my internship this summer and coming up with some plans and things to do that way. So, having some things that are still going to be there. They're going to be different, but I can still count on some of the experiences that I was hoping to have. That gives me something to look forward to, which is helpful for me, because sometimes living in the present is good, but it's also good to have something that you can look forward to when all of this is over.
Yeah, sure. And then finally, what advice would you give to students, to student affairs professionals who have grad students, and best ways to support them through this time?
Yeah, so I think two things really come to mind for me. The first is community. And of course, like, staff are dealing with so many things, a lot of the same things that grad students are dealing with, but also, their additional responsibilities and stressors. Um, but I think creating a space for community is really important, especially when you know that a lot of grad students might live alone. This is a time where it might be really easy to socially isolate, in addition to physically isolating, and that's not what we want. So even if student affairs professionals don't really have the time and energy to be present for, like, community building and connection, at least creating space for it, I think, is really valuable. So that so that students have the opportunity to connect with each other. We have a cohort based model, and so I feel like we already have some informal ways of connecting, but I can see in other programs where that's not the case, students might feel even a little bit more isolated. And so that would sort of be my first piece of advice. And then the second piece of advice that I hope is, the case even outside of times of pandemic, but see people as humans first, as people first, and students second. And part of that might mean encouraging them to take advantage, or like, prioritize their health and well-being before school, and be okay with, that work that really is just good enough, not necessarily perfect or stellar, but something that meets expectations. And whether that means lowering expectations or just kind of being flexible with what you are asking of grad students, I think that would be so appreciated. I've had that from my professors and my supervisors, and it really makes this a much easier time for me, especially, like, thinking about my own mental health and well-being. Those have been really valuable for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming again. And yeah, thank you so much. So have a good day, and yeah,
Take
have,
care.
bye.